That was the bell. You probably heard it. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 this morning. At least we're going to finish that up, and then we're going to get into chapter 11. We'll see, the original intention was to finish chapter 10 last week and then to get through this first section of chapter 11 today. So I hope we can get through all of that in the beginning of chapter 11 today so we don't leave it hanging again, but we'll see. To pick up where we left off in chapter 10, you remember this is in the middle of a discussion that really goes all the way back to chapter 8, and the initial issue was whether or not it was okay to eat meat that had been associated with pagan sacrifice. And some had argued that, well, we have knowledge, we know that an idol is not really anything, so of course it's no big deal. And Paul, at least initially, for the sake of argument, agrees with them. Well, you're right, there is only one God. And yet, so many of these people were coming out of idolatry, and this was potentially a stumbling block to them, dragging them back into idolatry. And so Paul says, forget this about whether or not there's anything wrong with what you're doing in itself. You need to be concerned about your brother being a stumbling block to him. And he ends there, chapter 8, he says that if eating meat will cause my brother to stumble, I won't eat it again from now on. And the whole larger issue here then is this idea of rights and responsibilities within the church, that sometimes you need to be not only willing, but you need to actually go ahead and surrender your rights if it's for the good of the body, for the unity of the church. If what you're doing, even if it's not wrong in itself, causes your brother or your sister to stumble. So just because you can do something, in other words, doesn't mean that you should do something. And throughout chapter 9, he talks about that in terms of his own rights, that he's surrendered, that he has the right as an apostle to support, but he's surrendered all of that because he doesn't want to be a stumbling block to anyone. Well, then in chapter 10, where we got into last week, he gives an example, first of all, of those who were God's people, who thought they had knowledge, who thought they were secure, but they ended up stumbling, and as a result, they found themselves destroyed. He looks back to this example from history of Israel in the wilderness, and he draws particular attention to the fact that they had God's presence there in the cloud, that God parted the sea for them, so he delivered them. He provided for them in food and in drink. You think of the manna, you think of the water coming up out of the rock. So they had all of these wonderful blessings, and yet he says that God was displeased with most of them there in verse number 5. They were overthrown in the wilderness. And the whole point of this, why he raises it with the Corinthians, is that you're repeating that same pattern. Just because you're God's people, just because you've been baptized into Christ, remember he uses that language of baptism and them passing through the sea, just because God's Spirit is present with you, just because you have that spiritual food and drink in the Lord's Supper, don't just assume that you can't fall. Don't assume that you've arrived, that you've got it made. You've had the very same experiences as Israel did in the wilderness, in a sense, and yet they fell. Most of them, everybody but Joshua and Caleb, they weren't allowed to enter the promised land. Well, that same thing could happen to you. The idea of this is these are more than just illustrations. It's part of a larger story, and in Corinth, they're part of that same story too. It's almost as if it's, I wouldn't say that history is repeating itself, but that they need to learn those lessons of the past so that they don't go in that very same way. We looked at the middle section of chapter 10 last week, and this is where we finished, verses 14 through 22, where he talks about then the table of the Lord versus the table of demons. So in the Lord's Supper, we really do share in something not only with each other, but with the Lord. That word there, the cup of blessing that we bless, this is verse 16, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? And the bread, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? That's that Greek word koinonia, which means fellowship, sharing, mutuality, joint participation. That's the way it's translated here. So on the one hand, we're all together participating in this confession of who we are and what we believe. And then we're also participating in this together. So we're showing that we're all part of this one body. And he draws the analogy to Israel. Well, when they participated in sacrifice, when they ate of that animal that was sacrificed, they became participants in that. That was fellowship. And so in the same way, those who eat and drink in the temple of an idol become partners with the idol itself. It's the analogy to the Lord's Supper and to Israel's sacrifice. But isn't an idol unreal? Verse 19, what do I imply? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? Yeah, an idol is unreal. He's already said that back in chapter 8, verse 4. But just because that idol does not represent an actual God does not mean that there aren't still these dark spiritual forces that can take advantage of that worship. He talks about them here as demons, demonic powers. It's the same sort of idea we see elsewhere in Paul, like in Ephesians, where we're not wrestling with flesh and blood, but with principalities, with powers, with these dark cosmic forces. The idea, I mentioned this before, but the New Testament is full of this. We need to remember that there are powerful forces at work in this world that are opposed to God, that are working against him. And so just because the idols themselves aren't real doesn't mean that there aren't these demonic forces that can take advantage of this worship and pull people down. And you think of all of those awful things associated with pagan worship that we've talked about before, the debauchery, the sexual immorality, all of these things. And so the whole point of this is you can't sit at the Lord's table and then go in to the temple of an idol and even flirt with that sort of thing, even entertain that possibility of interacting with, going back into that life. To use your freedom to just switch back and forth between these two realms, that's insane. It's madness. And at the least, it's putting the Messiah to the test. That's what he says. You're provoking God to jealousy. Well, now we want to get into the conclusion of chapter 10. I was trying to bring us up to speed, but this is what we didn't get to last week, starting here in verse 23. Paul wraps up this whole discussion by reiterating a theme from back in chapter 6 and then laying out some guidelines, big picture, larger principle guidelines to help us determine whether we should or we should not participate in any particular practice. So we have some good practical teaching here that extends beyond this specific issue of just eating meat offered to idols, which is, probably not something that we're going to face ourselves too often. But the big principles matter. Verse 23, all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner, and you're disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you, and for the sake of conscience. I don't mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whatever you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Be imitators of me, as I am of Christ. That's one of those places where the chapter division is unfortunate, because it seems most likely that 11 verse 1 really finishes off chapter 10, rather than starting off something new. So, Paul, on the one hand, condemns eating at a pagan temple, but on the other hand, he permits, at least generically, eating meat that's been offered to idols. What's the difference? That you know what? I'd say that's on the right track. I'd go even further. Um, what's what's the even bigger difference, not just knowledge, but of just eating this generically that you purchase, or if you go to someone's house and you don't know, versus eating it in a pagan temple? Were you going to say something? Yeah, that's true also. Why is eating in the temple particularly offensive? Right. I think that's right. If you didn't hear Wayne, if you go to the temple, you're essentially participating in that worship. I mean, that's the point he's just made that we read last week. And I think, don't everything that was said here is right, but don't overthink this part of it. Why does he permit eating meat in general that's been offered to idols versus forbidding eating in the temple? It's the temple that makes the big difference, first of all. It's the location. Paul wants them to be free to eat whatever's in front of them without fussing about where it came from, without asking all of these questions. You talked about you don't know, and I think that's part of the point, Wayne. After all, everything is ultimately from God. He says that, doesn't he, that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So ultimately, all this meat comes from God. But Paul, one more time here, says, just like he said back in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, that meat offered to idols shouldn't be eaten at sometimes. Not always, but sometimes you shouldn't eat it. And what are those times? One, like you just said, Wayne, obviously not in pagan worship. You shouldn't go to the temple. You shouldn't eat it there, because then whether you think you're participating in it or not, if you've somehow said, well, I'm just eating the meat, but I'm not really engaged in the worship, well, that's not going to fly with everyone else, because everybody else is going to see you there engaged in it. You're participating in it, however finely you try to slice this or not. But the other time you shouldn't eat it, and this is essentially what Brother Taylor said a moment ago, if someone else, presumably another Christian in this case, if someone else points out that this meat came from an idol temple, and that presumably means it's tainted in their eyes, it reminds them of their old life, the way that we've talked about before, well, then you need to have respect for that person's conscience and refrain. You're not in the temple, so you're not participating in the worship. And in general, Paul agrees, if you're not there, if you're eating this in the house or at someone else's house, no, there's nothing wrong with eating that meat because ultimately it came from God. But if it's something that potentially causes offense to someone else, if they bring that to your attention and it's going to offend them, then you need to refrain from it. And the reason he gives for refraining essentially is that it's not about the food itself. It's about the venue, not the menu. I guess we could put it that way. Raising the question, even in your home, if it's wrong universally to go eat it in the temple, raising that issue in the home. If I go to Jerry's house and he serves me meat, but Wayne's also there, and Wayne says, this came from a pagan temple. I don't feel good about eating that. It's almost as if it brings the temple into the house, so to speak. It makes that venue there. It's the venue that's problematic, but then you're bringing it here into Jerry's house. It's almost as if we're at the temple there together, at least as far as the conscience of Wayne is concerned. And so if he brings that up, well, then I don't need to eat it because it will bother his conscience. My freedom, which Paul says in general, if I didn't know, if Jerry doesn't have a problem with it, I don't have a problem with it, we can eat that meat. But if Wayne has a problem with it then and he brings it to my attention, my freedom is constrained by my obligation to him. I can't trample all over his conscience for the sake of my rights. And so just to bring those principles into wider application, in verse 31 down through chapter 11, verse 1, he gives some overarching principles that should help guide all of us in our behavior. What principles does he lay out here? There's a few. Yep, there's the first big one. Whatever you do, do it to God's glory. That's probably something that several in Corinth needed to hear in particular because they were more concerned with glorifying themselves than they were with God. What else? It's in verse 32. Yeah. Don't cause anyone to stumble or give no offense as much as possible to actually three different categories of people that he singles out here. The Jews, the Greeks, or the church. Now that's just as broad as it gets right there. Basically, he's saying everyone. Now you might need to think about these and how they would be specifically offended by your actions, but in general, try not to give any offense to these different groups. That's not always going to be easy, but if you think about over these past 3 chapters, Paul's laid out some general principles to help guide in that. And then finally, what's the last big principle to keep in mind? Well, that's true. Sure, we don't want to dismiss that because, in fact, that's something that he's appealed to as how to think through these things. But I guess I would say ask not so much what would Jesus do, but what would Paul do? That's what he lays out here. Remember that they have an example in him. Now, of course, Paul says ultimately he's looked at Jesus as his example. So Paul's asking what would Jesus do, but ask what would Paul do. I've thought about this often as a preacher. Would I be comfortable telling all of you, look to me, imitate me as I imitate Christ? That's a pretty heavy thing. I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that, but it reminds us of just how seriously Paul took his commitment here. Yeah, Wayne? I think there's a lot of truth in that. If you didn't all hear Wayne, he talked about the complaint you hear from a lot of people. They're not involved in the church because the church is full of hypocrites. Of course, one part of the answer to that is, well, of course, because it's full of human beings. And what better place for hypocrites than a church? Seriously. But it's reminding us of the power of our example, that we do really need to try to live up to what we claim to believe. And so Paul is saying here, be mindful of that. Look to me, I'm living it out, and then you need to do likewise. Some of the big principles to keep in mind over these last several chapters to help guide in decisions. Does the practice avoid a wicked lifestyle? That's something he said back in chapter 6, verses 12 through 20, when he talks there about fleeing sexual immorality specifically, but bigger picture, hey, your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, so you need to be really careful about how you live. Does the practice seek the good of our brothers and sisters? Something you mentioned, Wayne, even if he doesn't exactly say it right there at the end of chapter 10. He's been hitting on that repeatedly throughout these chapters. Does the practice ultimately bring glory to God? Something that he mentions explicitly there at the end of this. But the whole point is, in the end, we should all be willing to set aside our rights for the sake of fellowship with God and with each other. Anybody with any other questions or comments before we move on into chapter 11, which I can tell you right now we're not going to come close to getting through this first section today because we've only got about 15 minutes, but we can at least lay the groundwork for it here. Yeah, Lydia? I'd say that's not only a problem with new believers. If you didn't hear her, she said a lot of new believers think that we must be perfect, when of course we can't be. We've talked about this before. I think that's a problem that a lot of even mature Christians, people who've been Christians for decades, still struggle with that. And I think that's a real failure of a lot of our teaching. But I've mentioned to you all more than one conversation. I can think of so many people just right here off the top of my head who have said various different forms on when they're dying. I just hope I've been good enough, or I wish I'd lived better. I'm worried that I'm not going to be saved, and it's because they have that expectation that they have to be perfect, and if they're out of line at all, that every time we sin, we move in and out of salvation, which is, of course, not the case. It's about your trajectory, your direction, not about perfection. We've talked about that in 1 John and walking in the light, those of you who were in that class a few months ago. But it's a real failure in the way that we've taught. Not that we're not to strive for perfection. We are. We're to grow more into the likeness of Christ. And we should see ourselves becoming more and more like Him. And we should see ourselves leaving off some of those sins that we struggled with at one point in our lives. But we're not ever going to arrive in this light and life. And thankfully, our salvation doesn't depend on that. It depends on what He's already done for us and our faith and our trust in Him. Well, let's go on to chapter 11. As I said, we are not going to get through all of this because we're just going to be looking down through verse number 16. This is a very strange passage, a passage that is often difficult to understand, and that's for two reasons. One is because it's just kind of weird in itself, everything that he talks about here with head coverings and with praying and the prophesying of women here, and then what's up when he says down in verse number 10 that they ought to have this sign of authority on their head because of the angels. There's all sorts of strange things in here. And then it's secondly problematic because on the one hand, we see Paul talking about women praying and prophesying here. But you go just a few chapters later in 1 Corinthians, something that we see him talk about explicitly in verse number 34, as in all the church of chapter 14, as in all the churches of the saints, the women should keep silent in the churches, for they're not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. So this passage is difficult enough in itself, and then you go just a little bit later in this book, very same letter, and it seems like Paul's contradicting himself, depending on how you read this, that on the one hand he explicitly forbids women praying and prophesying, speaking in church, and then here he's talking about it. He says nothing to forbid it. If we were studying this thematically, just this concept, I'd have us look at chapter 14 first, but that's not the way we're doing this. We're working through this letter, even though I might reference some things in chapter 14 today, and when we get to chapter 14, I might come back and talk about this a little bit, just to draw some comparisons. But the question is, are these two passages in direct contradiction? Some people actually think so. If you were to start doing your own studying and reading some commentaries, just to give you one idea, this is from Leon Morris in the Tyndale New Testament commentary. He says, this verse, and he's talking about the passage we're reading here, 11:2, this verse plainly indicates that some Corinthian women prayed or prophesied in public worship. That Paul does not criticize the practice, but on the contrary, lays down the way women should be dressed when engaging in it, shows that he accepted it, which raises a problem with 14:34 and 35. That's just one commentator's view, but that's not an uncommon view that can't really reconcile these that easily. I don't actually think that that's the case. I don't think these are in contradiction. But I will say, I've already mentioned this, another thing that makes this so difficult is that this passage itself is not easy to interpret. The specific historical circumstances, the conditions here are really obscure. And to just give you what another commentator says here, this is Carl Holliday. This is that, what is that? Is it Living Word commentaries? We've got them in the church library. The red-backed ones, you know the ones I'm talking about. Published back in the 70s by Sweet Publishing Company. Great commentaries. But he says this: the meaning of these verses appears to be hopelessly unclear in spite of many ingenious but ill-fated attempts to explain them. The most one can hope for are a few shafts which might illuminate a few dark corners, but even then the room as a whole is still dimly lit. The commentator's task is to keep the obscure from becoming even more obscure. I think that's a good way to look at this. As we go through this passage, we'll try to talk about what was likely going on, at least to some extent. We'll give our best exegesis of this problem Paul's dealing with. But I will say, there are some things that we can say with certainty about this passage, and we need to let those things speak clearly to help us interpret those more obscure things that we find. And I'll lay out his reasoning here as we go through it, and when we get to chapter 14, we'll see how the reasoning is different. But what we really need to keep in mind are the different settings of these two passages, because I think, in my judgment, that's really the key to understanding what's going on and harmonizing these. So, I'm going to read this, chapter 11, starting in verse 2. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain their traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it's the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it's disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it's a disgrace for him, but if a woman has long hair, it's her glory? For her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. So I don't know how far we'll get into this, but the best place to begin is to give at least the best attempt we can at a reconstruction of what's going on here in Corinth. But I think the most important thing to note as we begin, and it's, if you picked up those questions from last week, it's the first one I have down there. What is this passage all about? What is the basic issue that he's addressing here? What's that? Appearance? In what sense? I think you're on the right track when you talk about appearance. That's important because some people will say, and I mentioned part of the problem with this is people say, oh, it's about women praying and prophesying. But it's not really about that. You're on the right track with appearance. And what you said about men and women is also important. But I'd say it's even more specific in that. David, you had your hand up first. I think that's the principle that undergirds what he's going to talk about. If you didn't hear David, that about how Christ or God ultimately is the head of everything. So we're talking about headship, about authority. But how is that manifested? What's the specific issue that he's dealing with in Corinth? I think you're right that part of this passage does deal with those different relationships, um, and the fact that there's some idea. Yeah, Jerry says head coverings. That's exactly right. That may seem so obvious that we don't get it. Uh, this passage is fundamentally about head coverings. Uh, Derek was on the right track, I think, when he talked about appearance, but it's specific to that. Now, everything else you guys were saying was right, because that's the reasoning for why these head coverings are important. This is an important tradition for that reason. Women praying and prophesying is not the focus of this passage. It's incidental. That's one thing. And the second thing to note is that this passage is not exclusively a discussion of the veiling of women wearing a head covering. Because if you noticed when we read through this, men and women are addressed in terms of wearing a head covering, in terms of what is culturally acceptable attire, their mutual relationship with each other, the respect that they need to demonstrate towards each other and towards God. And you guys were right in talking about the reasoning, but that reasoning is underlying why, on the one hand, men should not be wearing a head covering, and why, on the other hand, women should be. That's often missed, but did you notice Paul actually begins with the veiling not of women, but of men here? We talk about this in terms of the veiling of women so much, but he actually starts in verse 4, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. And he'll return to that 3 verses later in verse 7. A man ought not to cover his head, since he's the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. So that goes back to the reasoning some of you noted, but the issue is head coverings. I'm going to stop there because we're out of time, but I want you to keep that principle in mind. You might not have thought about that or realized that men covering their heads was even an issue in the ancient world. What in the world is this all about? Well, we actually have some evidence of this sort of practice, and it directly relates to the factionalism and the jealousy that we've seen over and over again at work in Corinth. Keep that in mind. Think about that. We'll come back to it next week. Thanks for your attention this morning.